We are now in chapter 7 of our book. We've come through the two sections of the Lord's Prayer, as Crossan has pointed out, the section dealing with God and God's hallowed name and God's will being done on earth. And then another section, the second section, which reflects that in many ways, is what we might call the collaboration aspect of the prayer, in which human beings seek out becoming imagers of God, I think is the best way to put it. Doing what God, I don't want to say commands, doing what God expects of them as people who have received grace. And one of the running themes throughout this book is the story of God's deliverance of the Hebrew people from Egypt. And I really like the way Crossan has developed that, using it as a paradigmatic story for explaining and illuminating the Lord's Prayer. But we've gotten through the section on giving us our daily bread. The idea being giving us the bread for today and freedom of want for the morrow. And now comes probably the most complex section. Complex probably isn't the right word, but what may be disturbing to many people, especially living as we do in a very market-driven capitalist economy, and especially given some of the current issues that we are encountering in our daily lives. For example, just today, President Biden had announced that he is going to be forgiving a certain amount of student debt. I can't remember how much of that it was, but I did find myself being a little bit envious there, because I worked diligently my whole life to try to pay off my student debt, and of course I did, but it really challenged me to think about the justice aspect of it. Just thinking about the number of students who now are really, the way that education has increased in terms of its, the price tag. It's probably too personal, but I was able to borrow $30,000 for a bachelor's degree, 2 master's degree, and a PhD. And all I had to pay back was $30,000. Well, that's unheard of today, because you can barely get through a couple of years of undergraduate, and because the prices have become so exorbitant. So the question has become, and it's a social justice, distributive justice issue, what are the benefits of remitting? Making sure that these students do not have to, start off their life with one foot in the debt hole. And so this story has not gone away. Another way that we see it is probably a less obvious way, because we don't hear about it that much, but it's no less important. But we will be talking about debt slavery and just slavery in general, and the need for reparations. After a slave has given his life and his work to the one he is indebted to. We have been having this national conversation for many years on reparations for those who were taken from their homes in Africa and caused to work under harsh conditions in the South, primarily cotton plantations and otherwise. And now, 150 years later, are these people, or at least their ancestors, due reparations? And it is a question that has this biblical facet to it. Though interestingly, we never hear it brought up when the story of reparations, or the idea of reparations comes into the dialogue. So where does all this begin? And as Crossan so often does, he goes all the way back to the very beginning. And we're talking about the very first city state that organized itself around a code, the Code of Hammurabi. Of course, actually, Crossan starts out with a little explication of the Rosetta Stone, which dates to about 196 BCE. And you all know that the Rosetta Stone was that bridge that allowed us to be able to translate ancient languages because of, it really served as a kind of a secret decoder ring. But in the Rosetta Stone, there were these provisions that were made by the king that we were talking about, Ptolemy the Fourth, in that he was in his grace going to, in his graciousness, going to remit the debts of his people. And there is a certain there's a certain wisdom that comes with this, because if you're not paying debts to somebody else, you've got more money to go into, to invest in the economy. So this is, I'm not an economist. And in fact, when I read people like Paul Krugman, when he starts to wonk out, as he says, my eyes kind of glaze over. But it does stand to reason that if you have more money in the economy, money that's not going to pay off the king and the government, or whoever is your creditor, that you're going to have a healthier economy. So periodically, the idea is that the remittance of debts, the forgiveness of debts, helps to fuel a healthy economy. So we see this happening in 196 BCE when the Rosetta Stone was made. But more interestingly, there is I can't remember if you call it a stele or a stela. I think it's a stela. But in the ancient Near East, they used to, erect these columns, which, told people who the king was and what the land required of them in terms of law. But that goes all the way back to Hammurabi. And those of you who are lawyers, I would be very, very surprised if you did not start your law degree by at least an intro lecture on the Code of Hammurabi. Hammurabi, the Babylonian king, who realized that, if the heavens are organized by the gods in such a way and that there is order among the gods, then there should also be a similar order among, those who are the gods' creation down below. And this unification of his empire, his city-state, around a number of a code of law. I think there are about 250 of these, case law. If this happens, then this is the response. If a animal falls into a pit, then this is the person who is going to be liable as a result of this. And this really becomes the model for the 10 Commandments. Many people don't like to acknowledge that because, we like to think that the 10 Commandments are utterly unique and come directly from God, and all of subsequent law is based upon them. Well, no, and not so much the case. It would be 500 years even prior to the time of Moses that the Code of Hammurabi is created for the government of the Babylonian Empire. But in that code, there is also provision made for slaves. These are people who have certain rights. And when you think about it, it's pretty extraordinary given human history over the last 3,000 years or so. A lot of people don't recognize the rights of slaves. But remember that we're talking about people who are your own countrymen, right? If they get into debt with you, then there are certain restrictions that you have. This does not take into consideration slaves who are the chattel of war, the spoils of war. They become property. But if we're talking about one of your fellow, someone recognized as a fellow human being, their humanity does not get lost because they have found themselves in a situation where they've either had to pledge part of their property or they've had to, borrow money at interest. And so Hammurabi, close to 4,000 years ago, one of the case laws on the stela here says this: if anyone fail to meet a claim for debt and sell himself, his wife, his son, and daughter, sell himself for money or give them away to forced labor, they shall work for 3 years in the house of the man who bought them or the proprietor. In the 4th year, they shall be set free. We're going to see a variation of this, about 500 years later in what's known as the Covenant Code. But this is probably one of the great inventions, we might say, of the second millennium BCE. I can't think of anything that would be more significant than this, because it is going to serve as the foundation for getting human beings to think about how to organize themselves around a certain code that has its source in the heavens. And you can see, if you look at the carving that's at the top there, this is Hammurabi getting the word straight from the god of justice, Shamash, in Babylon. And it's reminiscent, you might say, of Moses receiving the 10 Commandments. And on the column itself is written this case law in cuneiform, which is the oldest language that we know. Cuneiform, which was written primarily as an economic language, keeping records of who sold what to whom and how much and who owes whom, whatever the case. But later it develops into a more, kind of a narrative language as well, for expressing human ideas, human feelings. So 10 Commandments, we always talk about the law being founded on the 10 Commandments, and we want it in courthouses in Alabama. They have those scrolls laid out there and giving affirmation to the idea that all of human law is based on the Old Testament. Well, it actually precedes the Old Testament if we really get down to brass tacks, right? Are there any comments about this, especially from our legal people? Did you study the Code of Hammurabi when you were in law school? I know it's been
our founder, John Harrington, our founder, John Harrington, when he was in law school for 1 year, we had a contract professor who was pretty elderly, and John maintained that he'd actually studied under Hammurabi. But they did not really cover that for us a lot. But that stela that you were talking about, I recognize that. I believe that it's reproduced in the state capitol. I couldn't tell you if it was in the Supreme Court chambers or not, since I haven't had to argue a case there for 40 years. But I know that looked familiar to me from somewhere in the Capitol, and we do in the Capitol recognize both Hammurabi, I think, and also all of Moses and the lawgivers. But as far as the contents go, not so much.
Yeah.
Dan,
yeah, go ahead, Denny.
was there a spillover from the Code of Hammurabi to the 600 plus commandments in the Torah, the Talmud?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, it's almost word for word in what we call the Covenant Code. If you look in Exodus chapter 20, you get the 10 Commandments, which is like the Cliff Notes version of the several. They're not 613. Those are going to be developed much, much later, up to the time of Jesus. But there is a series of what we call case law types of examples. If a man digs a pit and another farmer's animal falls into the pit, who's liable for this? Or if if two men are fighting, and some of it's really ridiculous stuff. If two men are fighting and a woman jumps in and the woman has her tooth knocked out because she's hit, who's liable for that? And it's really interesting to read, but not well, actually bedtime reading would be good because it'll put you right to sleep. And we're told that this covenant code, and it's Exodus 22 through about Exodus 23 that we're talking about, but it's a lot of series of if then statements. If this happens, then this is what you do. If this happens, then this is what you do. But the idea is that this was written in the desert, but the context makes it clear that this code was being written when the people were already in the land, because there are so many agricultural references, about who's liable if somebody's property gets hurt, but in that code also are the very prescriptions and proscriptions that we're going to be talking about. What happens economically when somebody has to sell themselves to you, and how should we use our money with respect to the community? And though it is not really well known, it's pretty clear throughout the Hebrew Bible that lending money at interest is, well, I should make the distinction. Lending money at interest to your countrymen, to your fellow Israelites. There were two types of lending. There was lending for commercial purposes, and this was usually to people from outside the fold. But lending money to people within the fold, taking advantage of their very tragic situations, somebody's farm, they lose their crop due to whatever type of tragedy, and thus they have to borrow money to live on for the rest of the year. Well, there are all kinds of possibilities for predatory lending there, right? Well, predatory lending as we know it, and I would include in this the the predatory lending that comes from our credit card companies, when charging people 29% interest sometimes. I remember when I first started teaching at University of Tennessee, the very first day of class, they had the credit card companies out there saying, hey, get yourself a credit card, it's easy money to pay off books and things like that, all the time, just wanting to capture the economic future, really, of those students who would be using that credit card. But it's a type of slavery. In fact, Crossan makes it very clear that we talk about debt slavery, we talk about manumission, or slavery that involves giving over your labor to somebody. And we look at that as, a barbaric part of our past. But now we have another type of what he calls neo-slavery, a new type of slavery, which is this indebtedness to our credit card companies. People renting us money at very high interest rates. And frankly, turning around every Sunday and going to church and feeling just happy to do it, right? But Crossan says this is contrary to the whole Sabbath aspect of the householder's plan for creation. If shalom is something that runs throughout the created order, and if that shalom, that peace, that rest is acknowledged periodically, every seventh day, every seventh year, every 50th year, Sabbath of Sabbaths, then it is incumbent upon us to image the householder and also to practice Sabbath in everything we do, also to practice distributive justice in everything we do. And the hardest thing for us to do, living as we do in our context, is to really get a sense of this idea of forgiving loans. You know, it seems almost ridiculous for it. What do you mean forgive loans? People borrow money, they have to pay it back, right? That's not the way this worldview works that we're talking about here. So we're talking about debt slavery, how people used to find themselves in situations where they needed a little extra help. And one of the things that the prophets just rail against all the time are the people who will take a woman's cloak or a widow's cloak in pledge, right? Because that's collateral. This is like a pawn shop, right? This is what pawn shops do. I need a little money. I'm going to give you my guitar, or I'm going to give you my color television. And then when I have the money, I'll bring it back. And of course, the pawn shop owner usually ends up being the winner in this. And well, this goes all the way back to ancient Israel, where Israelites were doing this to their fellow Israelites, but eventually the whole world comes to be part of this. Your fellow human beings do not need to be the victims of your good fortune, right? So we're talking about debt, we're talking about slavery. And it is kind of unfortunate that slavery is something, and we're talking about debt slavery here, and it is something that was practiced or appears to have been practiced in ancient Israel. It was these references in Leviticus and Exodus and Deuteronomy that gave slave owners in the South justification for not only their ownership of slaves, but also the treatment of slaves as being property, chattel. They don't have to be seen as, you know, fully human. And they can be sold back and forth. But it was also a different understanding of the understanding that Crossan is talking about here, that this was debt slavery, and this was something that had a Sabbath at its end. This was what informed the abolitionists in the United States as well, that, you know, these are provisions that are not meant to be universal over an infinite period of time. And you probably also know about the sons of Ham idea that they would be forever doomed to be the slaves of the people of Israel, because Ham saw his father Noah naked, and thus he and his ancestors were cursed. Well, there are all kinds of, you know, justifications in the mid 19th century for people owning slaves, and it's unfortunate that the Bible was the foundation for a lot of that. So when we get into this idea of forgiving debts, we've got subsistence loans and we've got commerce loans. The commerce loans are loans outside the Israelite community, but giving money to those who need it within your community should never be an opportunity for your advancement. And the model for this is what God does to and for the people of Israel in Egypt. God sets them free. God draws them out of the land of bondage, out of, you know, the house of bondage, as they say, out of the land of Egypt, where they were toiling in enslaved situations. And if God, you know, here's the logic: if we are created in the image of God and we are asked to image God in all of our actions, then one of the actions that God does is to deliver people from bondage. then we must also work towards that kind of Sabbath idea as well. And so we see a variation on the Code of Hammurabi, but this one is informed by the 7-day Sabbath idea, or the understanding of every seventh year being a year, or every seventh day being a time when peace and distributive justice and shalom is acknowledged in the land. So in Leviticus 25, if any of you fall into difficulty and become dependent upon you, you shall support them. They shall live with you as though resident aliens. Resident aliens, the focus being on resident here. You shall not lend them your money at interest, take it in advance, or provide them food at a profit. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan to be your God. I always see my spelling mistakes when I'm recorded here, and I go over it with a fine-tooth comb. God brought them out of the land of Egypt. He is their model. It doesn't make sense there for you to be lending money at people and taking advantage of their disadvantaged situation. Providing food, for profit. One of the things that's been happening recently, and I don't know if this is misinformation or not, but one idea that I've heard is that many of our food producers in corporate America have greatly benefited from inflation. They have been able to hike prices and take advantage of this situation. Anybody have any thoughts on that? I don't know if that's just left-wing propaganda or not, but I can see it as a potential possibility. They're not hurting. Their profits, their quarterly profits, have actually risen over the last 2 years, or so I have heard. Does anybody have any more accurate information on that? Do you know?
Dan,
Yeah, Danny.
that is incredibly complex issue that you've raised there in terms of price pressures. And yeah, I'm not disputing what you just said, but I would love to live in the land that we're talking about, in the society that we're talking about, with the forgiving of debts and whatever. But economics as a study is the study of the distribution of scarce resources. And if we look at post-agricultural society, or the beginnings of agricultural society, and then the beginnings of, society after the majority of people began living in large cities where they're not engaged in subsistence agriculture.
Yeah.
What's the alternative? How are they going to feed themselves? Scarcity is such a critical issue if you're living in Omaha or New York or Chicago or Hastings.
Mm-hmm.
How on earth are we going to feed ourselves unless there is an incentive, to get people to produce at a profit so they can go back and do their thing? I wish it weren't so, but this scarcity issue is really, really important for all of you to consider, all of us to consider. What's the alternative?
Yeah. And the alternative has been shown to be incapable of producing the goods necessary, because Maoist and Stalinist communism would be the alternative. Wouldn't that be one way of looking at it? Everybody pitch in and do your job. Well, we had people starving in both of those countries.
You know how that movie ended.
I'm sorry?
You know how that movie ended.
Yeah, we know how that movie ended.
Yeah, Mao Zedong's wonderful little experiment, lives of millions of Chinese.
Yeah.
But I don't know, when urban people are so specialized in their skills and their vocations, raising food is simply not one of their skills.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't know how to get around that.
Yeah, I know. And which brings us to the idea of, capitalism isn't the best system, but what is the alternative, right? The one thing that capitalism does well is it recognizes the fundamental depravity of human beings in terms of competition. Everyone thinks this is such a God-given economic system, and in many ways it is. But Adam Smith was an avowed atheist, and David Hume was on the deathbed of Adam Smith. No, it was the other way around. I can't remember, but the two of them knew each other in Scotland. But they were always concerned that the other was going to give up his atheism because it was pretty radical at the time. But they were the first to develop a rational system that did not involve the importance or the centrality of a divine being, right? All we need is for human beings to act like human beings, and supplies and demands will be, balanced out based upon scarcity or abundance of resources. Prices will rise or drop. It's a wonderful system, but at the source, at the core of the system, is this idea that human beings are not naturally good. That the alternative to what you're talking about, whether it's Mao or Stalin, assumes that human beings will work for the good of the community out of the goodness of their heart. And it just doesn't work out that way. Hobbes had it right that human beings, they want to compete, and if it weren't for a highly structured landscape, if it weren't for a very absolutist king, they would be at each other's throats. Well, a few hundred years later, 100 years later, Adam Smith was able to figure out, it can regulate itself just by economics, scarcity of resource, production, all of those things that go into the capitalist system. But the way that works is by capital. It takes money to make money, and the way you make money is one of the ways to do it is to make it work for you. We are all gaining interest off of our retirement accounts, right? And that's the way the system works. We think in terms of socially just investing, but I don't know what the rate of return has been on those types of social justice investments. Anybody have any ideas on that? Have they been equally as successful as the more aggressive investors? I know it's something that TIAA has offered us, and I'm in it, but I don't compare my portfolio with anybody else's. Probably wouldn't compare very well. Anyway, I do want to point out here. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but you're right, Denny. This is so very complex. Because we can critique our current economic system, but we can't come up with a better system. Unless, I've been thinking a lot about this in terms of how can we ensure that people are not being, sucked into neo-slavery, being enslaved by interest rates or enslaved by the poverty that's created by a system where there's scarcity of resources and competition for those resources. And I keep coming back to an idea that is not very popular, but the forgiveness of debt in some ways can be covered by a fair taxation of those who have an inappropriate amount of money, right? Basically, I'm talking about taxing the rich. And that there's only so many utils of pleasure you can get out of the money you have. Over and above that, you don't really need that much money. So why not distribute it according to the government and taxation to those who need it? It's a type of debt forgiveness in many ways. It, it of course, it doesn't affect me because I'm not gonna be one who's gonna have be in that high tax bracket and a progressive type of income tax. But Warren Buffett has talked about this many times, hasn't he? I mean, he's
Yes.
beside himself that his secretary is in a higher income tax bracket than he is. In other words, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say it that way. She pays more income tax percentage wise than he does. Well, it's legal, right? It's the way the law works. And that's all we have to do is follow the law. Well, unless we work by a different law, the different law that we're talking about here. What's legal may not necessarily be moral, right? What is going to ensure that God's name is hallowed and God's will is done in order that the kingdom of God is established on earth? That's the question that I think is really difficult for us, especially in the upper middle class echelons, to think about. Because we've all been raised to, imagine our self-worth in terms of the money that we make, the possessions that we have. And then when the church tries to come in and say, you might want to think about this, so you might want to think about the ethics of owning so much, or, not paying as a percentage of tax that's relevant to, the need of others. People bristle, they get very, very upset about it, which makes you wonder, what is where are our real values? Where do they lie? So I'm sorry if I'm making anyone uncomfortable with this, but we're not in church. We're having an intellectual discussion. But this whole idea, I put this image of El Greco's Christ driving the money changers from the temple. This was the source of Jesus being upset. I don't want to say anger, but maybe it was anger. It was the source of Jesus going into the temple. And there would be people there who were basically lending money at interest. They would change money from the Roman money to shekels, and they would charge sometimes an exorbitant rate of doing it. And so it's Passover, and you have poor people coming from all over the land, and they haven't brought their own sacrifice with them. And so you have to buy a sacrifice in the temple, and you don't have temple money. So somebody has to change that money from Roman coins to temple coins. And somebody's going to be pulling money out for doing it. And this is what incensed Jesus. This is a variation on the idea of lending money at interest. You're taking advantage of people who are in a very vulnerable and precarious situation. So the one time that we can at least acknowledge that Jesus got a little bit upset was around this issue. That is, if practiced on a large scale, is tantamount to slavery, to debt slavery. So, any thoughts on this?
And interesting, Dan, that Muhammad in the Quran, picks up that theme that you just articulated, not charging interest, particularly to one's own.
Yeah, and that's where people will will hedge a little bit. Well, it's not to our own, but with the coming of Christ, who is not part of the kingdom of God, right? And I know what I'm talking about here undermines our entire capitalistic system. um, and I haven't, it makes me very uncomfortable because I benefit from the very system that I'm critiquing here. But trying to find a good balanced way to be householders in that system, the way that Crossan is encouraging us to do, it's very difficult. Crossan asked the question, well, was this ever practiced? Was this ever practiced in reality? And he's got two stories, and I want to try to get through this chapter, but so I'm going to put them in together. He's got two stories that he draws on from ancient Israel, the time of ancient Israel. The first story happens around 445 BCE, but the other story that he will talk about later on in the chapter precedes the Nehemiah story that we're about to talk about. Crossan asks the question, was this just theory or was it just, as in justice-oriented, practiced? And he says that there's evidence in scripture that the leaders of Israel drew upon their ancient tradition at a time when it was probably not the most convenient to do so. You know the story of the Babylonian captivity. You know that the aristocratic class of Jerusalem in 587 was taken from their city and shipped off to Babylon. So you had all of the priests and you had all of the aristocrats, the aristocratic class and a lot of the artisans, but there were still people left back in Jerusalem who were basically, they were going to be more of a drain on the system. So a group of people spends time in Babylon for about 50 years until a great king of Persia by the name of Cyrus comes onto the scene. And Cyrus defeats the Babylonians. And by the way, I think I've mentioned this before. If you read Isaiah 45, where Cyrus is seen as, this pagan instrument of the Lord, he's doing God's work, even though he is not, a believer in God. Because that's in Isaiah 45, many today are claiming that our 45th president, who happens to be Donald Trump, is a fulfillment of this prophecy in Isaiah, that he, like Cyrus, is going to relieve the people of their slavery, and it's part of there was a faction of Republican evangelicals who believe that this is a prophecy of Donald Trump. Just wanted to throw that in there. But Cyrus of Persia makes it possible for the people to return to Jerusalem, because the Babylonians and the Persians had two ways of looking at the world. The Babylonians were short-term thinkers. They like to go into places, destroy them, loot them, and take everything for what it's worth and just leave things smoldering, right? The Persians were long-term thinkers. They said, we let people, prosper in their own land, but we ensure that they pay taxes to us over the long period. So it's not like, I get my paycheck and I go blow it. That's the Babylonians, right? It's like, no, I think I'm going to invest in this at the rate of 4%. That's what the Persians did. And they said, Cyrus said, you Jews, as they were being called then, you go back to Jerusalem, you rebuild your city, and I want that city to be revived so that I can tax it. Well, this is what happens. And the Jews have a very difficult time until a couple of Babylonian appointed leaders, Ezra and Nehemiah, Their books can be read in the Old Testament. Go back and organize the people around this. Well, Nehemiah really went back to tax the people. You know, it's been 100 years now. We need to start collecting. Well, it's been 70 years or so. We need to start collecting taxes from you. And so the people felt very put upon, and the aristocrats would pay their tax, but the poor people who were in the land, you know, who were just basically subsistence farmers, did not have the money to pay the tax. So what happened is the Jewish aristocrats would lend them the money, and they would get into basically debt slavery until Nehemiah thinks it over, scratches his head and says, this is not good Jewish practice. We are defying, we are transgressing what God requires of us in the covenant code. We should not take advantage of those. And so what he does is he releases everybody from debt slavery, because the so-called have-nots were protesting as a result of that. Unfortunately, what happens, though, is that it doesn't, people say, well, we'll agree not to, you know, charge interest on money, but we will take pledges. We'll take collateral from the poor, usually their land, right? Which, by the way, in the Old Testament, the land doesn't belong to anyone but God. We are just caretakers of that land. So you really can't own land, but people would pledge their land. And this is how the aristocrats became wealthier and wealthier. And, you know, there's a class of Jews who became poorer and poorer. This would eventually develop into two types of Judaism. The Christianity that would ultimately develop would come out of that poorer type of Judaism that we're talking about here. So I'm trying to cover way too much. I'm sorry. But what Nehemiah did here was say, look what happened to us a long time ago. The reason we went to Babylon in the first place is because we weren't acknowledging, you know, our obligation to our so-called resident aliens, to the poor, to the widow, to the orphan, those who can easily be taken advantage of and can easily fall into debt slavery. And this is where the story of Jeremiah 34 comes into the picture, in that the people of Jerusalem would not release their slaves, so to speak, would not forgive the debts that Zedekiah the king. Now, Jeremiah was living before the Babylonian captivity, probably around 600 BCE. And Zedekiah, the last king of, you know, of pre-Babylonian captivity, wanted to try to get the economy moving again, right? And so he had those who were creditors, had everybody release the debts, you know, of the debtors, but they didn't end up doing it. And eventually what happened is the Babylonians came into Jerusalem and took the temple, took the city, and it was understood by Jeremiah that this was God judging the people for not remitting, for not forgiving the debts of the poor. And these are the bookends that Crossan talks about. The Jeremiah story, where God punishes people for not forgiving debts, and the Nehemiah story, where there is shalom in the land as a result of forgiving of debts. I want to get to this place. I've been thinking about this, you know, the sharecropping system after, I don't have much time here, but Crossan says sometimes a pledge can be more manipulative than interest. And I couldn't help but think of the sharecropping system, where, you know, these slaves were released from their slavery, but many of them had no place to go in the South. So they made an agreement with the landowners that they would sharecrop, right? They would plant the cotton or whatever it was, and they would take a share of that, and while the landowner would get the greatest portion of it. Well, that just became another form of slavery, right? Another example of this is from my own background. Uh, when I was a kid, my grandmother used to have this whole, it was just like this little bowl that had scrip in it. And scrip were these coins that you see here. And I'm sorry if you already know this, but scrip was the coins that coal companies would use to pay their employees with. And it could only be used in the company store. So let's say your weekly pay was $20, and you would get, 4 of these script coins were basically, just they were aluminum, and they were utterly worthless. The only place you could spend that would be in the store that was owned by the very company. And so naturally the company says, well, you don't have enough money for food this week, so we'll just give you a little bit of credit. And so it's like that old song, Tennessee Ernie Ford, I owe my soul to the company store. You keep buying on credit, and you are utterly enslaved to the coal company. It was a horrendous way to treat human beings. But I do, there is a story that my cousin and I don't remember this, but we took a bunch of these script coins from my grandmother's little collection and tried to take it down to the drugstore to buy bubble gum, but it didn't work. It wasn't the company store. But interesting time in Appalachia history, that is to say the least. Anybody else have examples of this idea from your own experience or the past? Go ahead, Danny. Yeah.
Just a quick that so many blacks who were really disgusted with sharecropping, but more importantly, the abuse and lynching in the South. The Warmth of Other Suns is a marvelous book I recommend to all of you. Resulted in the Great Black Migration, out of the South to New York, to Chicago during World War II to fill, jobs that were left available, or just an economic boom, and to the West Coast. And the same thing, I think, seems to have happened with white, low whites, as they're referred to, or white trash. And they took with them their religion, they took with them their food and their values. And in some ways, here we are in 2024 with those values front and center.
Right. Well, that was called the Hillbilly Highway, and I-75, people would go up to Detroit, the white trash, as you call them. They would get those high-paying jobs up in Detroit at the auto factories. But then they would sometimes come back to Appalachia, and it kind of created this class system there that created a lot of resentment as well. My grandparents were people who took the Hillbilly Highway. It was to a steel mill. It wasn't to. It was one form of slavery to another. But there were some in the generation after that went, to Detroit. And the other migration you mentioned, Denny, one of the results of that, what actually was pre-World War II, the migration from the South to the North created the Harlem Renaissance, when we had blacks from all over the South coming into Harlem, and the variety of experiences there created just this very creative mix of people, out of which people like Zora Neale Hurston and others evolved. But yeah, you're right. People fleeing forms of slavery. I was hoping today to get to this idea of why we'll have to do it next time. But you all know that if you visited a church other than a Presbyterian church, when you say the Lord's Prayer, you often say trespasses. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Well, at the end of this chapter, Crossan gives a really good, brief, succinct explanation of how that happened. And I'll just tip my hand a little bit here. We'll talk about it next time. But basically, what he says is that this idea of forgiveness of debts on the lips of Jesus was meant to be taken literally. Because it's a reflection of this whole Levitical and covenant code that we've been talking about. Releasing people from their debt slavery. And it goes hand in hand with this idea of having bread for the day and, good work conditions for the morrow as well, not being indebted. But what happens over time is that very literal interpretation of debts comes to take on a metaphorical meaning of sin, or a more symbolic meaning of sin, which comes to find its way into the Lord's Prayer as trespasses. For this reason, Crossan, I've heard him say that if he weren't Roman Catholic and so committed to that, that church, he would probably be Presbyterian, precisely for this idea that we still hold to this debt language in the Lord's Prayer. It's a complex issue, and I'm sorry if I pontificated too much about some aspects of capitalism that I personally struggle with. I ask your forgiveness if it's offended anybody. So next time I'll finish up this chapter 7, and then we'll get into what seems like an odd request. Lead us not into temptation. Why would God lead us to be tempted, right? I've always questioned that. It seemed like, even as a kid, why would God lead me to be tempted when he doesn't want me to be tempted? Well, Crossan's going to deal with that, and I think in a very satisfying way. Anybody want to have a few last words here? I appreciate the time that you take out of your day to let me talk about this and to talk about it with me. We're almost at the end of this book, and if you have suggestions, or if you have a direction you would like us to go, we've been looking at a lot at the Jesus Seminar people. It would not be against any kind of written or unwritten rule to go in a different direction, I don't think. So still in the tradition of our founder, John Harrington, to be eternally curious about many things. If not, I am going to release you from our share here. Thank you, everyone, and I hope you all have your gardens planted. And we kind of missed a bullet with the tornadoes, it seems. Greenfield, Iowa has apparently not come through very well, so definitely keep them in your prayers. I'll go ahead, Danny.
Plant those gardens so we can all share.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I'm trying to remember how to.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'll see you later. And I just have to remember how to get out of this. I can't. So you guys leave, and I'll just turn it off as I go.